So let's get started on this. So I think the most important thing to understand with regards to transactional analysis is that there are these three ego states. Ego states being like sort of, I mean, what do you think that means?
America.
No. Ego states. Very good. There's actually more than three ego states in America. But
I only recognize three.
wow. I think that was a declaration of war, Corey. So there are these three sort of models of self: the adult, the child, and the parent. Not necessarily in that order. It's usually in the order parent, adult, child. And that's because the adult sits between the parent and the child. We'll get onto that in a second. As in, like, the adult is the mediator between the parent and the child.
Oh, wait. No, I don't know why I'm looking confused, because I have heard this before and I do understand what you're saying.
So, and basically we use this model to analyze transactions, not financial transactions, by the way. Well, actually, at one point I was like just wanting, like, you know how like when you're researching an episode, the first thing you might do is scan the Wikipedia page, right? Yeah. One of the first things I did was I scanned the Wikipedia page and I asked ChatGPT about it. And I was like, transactional analysis, just like give me a quick summary for it, see what it says. And it goes, transactional analysis is helpful when used in business to analyze transactions between companies. And I was like, no, you're an idiot. You're such an idiot. No one calls that transactional analysis. I'm doing a bit of transactional analysis today on my bank statements. Shut up.
Language models are good for learning things, I think.
So what do you think transactions might be?
Oh, like social interactions, right?
Exactly. So we're having a transaction right now. When you interact with another person, when you have any kind of conversation, when you try to come up with a solution to something, when you try to agree on something, anything, any interaction between people is a transaction. So
I don't do any of those things. All interactions for me are about me. I only solve my own problems and I don't give nothing.
We're going to get a crowbar and prise you apart into your parent, adult, and child states. So basically, what transactional analysis says is that when you are having these transactions, these conversations, interactions with people, you are doing this from one of three broad places, right? So those would be the ego states, the parent, the adult, or the child state. Right? So the parent state is our attempt to copy behaviors or attitudes that we picked up from our parents, obviously, but also maybe just from authority figures in general. They're the ways that we think the world should be. They're the ways that we think other people should behave. They're the ways that we think we should behave. And inside of the parent state, we have two sort of sub-states, which are the controlling parent, which is like critical, for example. Mm-hmm. It tries to control, it tries to compel behavior, that kind of thing. And the nurturing parent, the sort of loving parent, right? And these are broad aspects of...
Mummy and daddy.
Well, but they're broad aspects of mummy and daddy, right? So mummy and daddy might tell you off. They might tell you to do things. Like authority figures might tell you to do things. And then mummy and daddy, hopefully, sometimes will nurture you and go, oh, it's okay. And that's sort of both healthy parts of being a parent, right? On the absolute opposite... Sorry.
News to me!
I just missed that completely.
Okay, if you say so, bud.
This is why I used the word hopefully. On the other side, we have this thing called the child state, right? So the child state, what do you think the child state might be? Now you've heard the parent, what do you think the child state might be? So
to draw from popular culture, a recent film, one could say, Pinocchio.
Oh, I actually didn't read about Pinocchio in the literature, but maybe I didn't delve into Jordan Peterson enough.
Pinocchio has Jiminy Cricket, who is the parent, the conscience, right?
Right.
And so Pinocchio, I guess, would be the inner child, which is the one that's just like, I'm whatever want I have, I'm gonna seek it out. Right?
Okay.
Is that it? I don't know.
That's part of it, actually. You've really nailed that part of it. So the child state is primarily concerned with feelings. It's about spontaneity, which is what you're talking about here with Pinocchio. But it's also ways we were conditioned to act as a child, right? So it's the things that we think like, almost like, if I don't do this, something bad will happen because I was trained to do it.
Anxiety.
Potentially. I'm not going to get into specifically mapping transactional analysis onto other concepts like anxiety. But yes, exactly. Like broadly speaking, yes. The child part of you is the part of you that is, or this part of the child is the part that's like, worried about a consequence for something, like worried that something might happen because you did a bad thing. And that's a result of the training we received either from parents and authority figures or maybe just from the world in general.
Can I go on a tangent? I'm going to do it anyway.
Please.
I'm not asking. I'm going on a tangent. So I was sitting down doing something the other day, and every now and then, I wouldn't say it's OCD, right? But every now and then, I feel I need to do something. Something silly. Like, for example, that was what it was. I was eating a burger, and I put the burger down upside down because it was easier, right? It's easier to pick up a burger that's upside down when you put it down that way, right? But it felt like, oh, this is wrong. This is the wrong way to put a burger down. It should be down on its bottom because that's the way that burgers are supposed to go.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like, sometimes I do that, and there's this little feeling inside of me, like, it needs to be the right way up, or something bad will happen. And like, again, I'm not saying it's like OCD or anything, because it's definitely not. I don't spend nearly enough time doing silly little tasks that don't need to be done, right? To qualify remotely for that. So I was thinking, like, well, what if I just leave it upside down? It's like, well, something bad might happen. Right, but do you really think that you have power over the universe to cause something so bad to happen by leaving a burger upside down? Do you think you have that power? You self-centered piece of, like, how dare you think that? How self-centered can you be? And I was like, oh yeah, I suppose. And then I continued eating my burger and didn't think about it again. That's a way to train yourself out of doing dumb things, I guess. There you go. That's useful, right?
That's really interesting. I mean, this is something I think we'll get into a little bit later as well, about the kind of conversation you had there in your head. But yeah, I mean, essentially, like, again, I will sometimes apply, like, colloquially in this conversation, like, my basic understanding of transactional analysis to have conversations like this. But this is not necessarily how a therapist would say it, and it's definitely not necessarily a valid application of transactional analysis in a clinical setting. But essentially, you could view that as, like, your controlling parent has sort of picked up the broad patterns of the world, that the way the world should be, the sort of safe states of the world, and is leaning on your what is called, which I'll get into, a conditioned child, right? The child that sort of follows those patterns that it learned from the world of how to be safe. And when you are stepping outside of those patterns, it's not necessarily that you've either been told by somebody something bad will happen if you turn your burger upside down and put it down, but you're stepping outside of the safe zone, right? The safe known, like the safe known manifestations of life, and then you're in the unknown, right? And you don't know what will happen. And then that sort of interplay between this conversation that's happening in your head, you could sort of view it in that way. You've got this conditioned child that knows the safe states, that knows the states that it can put the world in where things are okay, and you're stepping outside of that. I think that's pretty interesting.
I'm surprised you got all of that out of me putting a burger down.
To be fair, you did a lot of the work. So let's get back to it. So the child, right? So you know how I said the parent has these sort of two subsections of, like, the nurturing parent and the controlling parent. So the child also has these two subsections, which are called the conditioned child.
But it has nice hair.
Shut up. Just repeat that in case people couldn't hear it on the podcast.
Bet it has nice hair.
Bet it has nice hair. Now, the other one is the free child, right? And this is exactly what we've just seen when you said bet it has nice hair. So the conditioned child is the ways that we are trained to behave, as I said. So these are the things that we've adapted. They might be the ways we trained as in directly being told, or it might also be, it's also something called the adapted child. So it might be like ways that you adapted your own behavior to exist in the scenario you had, right? So you might have, as people do, parents who don't always behave entirely rationally and logically. And if you get a parent that blows up over something small, you become conditioned to not do that thing, even though you weren't specifically told not to do it. But by circumstance, by necessity, in order to avoid bad feelings, you were trained to exist in that way, right? So that's the conditioned child. And that's, again, I will get into this later, but it's not always a bad thing. It's not like any of these states are objectively bad. Although it sounds on the surface like, oh, the conditioned child, that's like the child that's been trained, the child that stays in line, the child that's scared to step outside the boundaries.
Yeah, but then the boundaries could also be, hey, when you point at someone and say, haha, you're ugly, that causes bad things to happen. And that makes you feel bad, along with making them feel bad. And so you don't do that. So, like, conditioned could just be interacting with people in a polite and kind way.
Exactly. For example, as a child, I never listened to my granny when she told me not to touch the iron. I then touched the iron, and I learned very quickly why I'm not meant to touch the iron.
Oh, I have a similar story. I was sat in the car. This is ADHD, by the way. I was sat in the car by myself. I was bored. Parents had gone in to do something. They had been gone for all of maybe 5-10 minutes. And do you know the little things in cars that they used to have to like light cigarettes?
Yes, the cigarette lighter.
The cigarette lighter.
Oh,
right?
you took it out and you stuck your finger
I put my finger on it.
Yeah.
I wanted to see. I was like, what? Like, I don't know. Like, this is hot, I guess. But like, what would happen if I touched it? Literally had a ring burn mark on my finger. And my parents got back into the car. I was trying to hide it, but I had a burn on my finger in the shape of a ring. They were like, what is going on? They realized that this supposedly smart child just stuck his finger on a hot object for no reason.
And it was at that moment they should have taken you to a psychiatrist and asked if you had ADHD. But instead,
honest,
it
there's
took
many
20
moments
years
they should
more.
have taken me to a psychiatrist. But yeah.
Okay, so this is the controlled child, right? The sort of conditioned child, the adapted child. And then we also have this free child, which is the child that you just demonstrated by saying the conditioned child has nice hair because he's using conditioner, right? Which is the child that is spontaneous,
Funny.
maybe funny, creative, free, and uninhibited, basically. Like just absolute spontaneity without really thinking about the consequences or thinking things through very much. So you can see that basically the child and the parent kind of link in different ways. So, for example, the nurturing parent nurtures the ability for a free child, and the controlling parent creates and affects the controlled, adapted child, right?
How long has this concept been around?
So it was published in the 60s in this book, Games People Play. And so it's been around for a fair while, yeah.
You did say that, yeah. No, because there
Don't
was
worry,
a Simpsons
I often
episode.
ignore things that you say on the podcast, don't worry.
I didn't ignore it. I just did not remember it. No, there's this episode of The Simpsons called Bart's Inner Child. I think it's season 5-ish. Anyway, this guy comes to town called Brad Goodman, and he says a lot of what you're saying now, but his conclusion is to just free the inner child, but not the conditioned child, the free child. And then, because he's like, oh, this is Bart Simpson. And I'm thinking about it, and the free child is essentially just Bart Simpson, right? Just like sort of creativity, impulse, like doing stuff, even if they're like not even really considering consequences or thinking it, just doing things.
Well, and to extend your comparison, the conditioned child is Lisa Simpson.
Oh!
Right, so Lisa is the perfect child, does everything she's told, works really hard, works really hard to make the world better, all those things. She's emulating exactly what she thinks is the best way to be.
That is so true. Oh my gosh! And then the parents are probably the parents. That's crazy how this parent-child relationship is shown up in a parent-child relationship. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Well, yes, but in The Simpsons, Marge is kind of the controlling parent and the nurturing parent, and then Homer is just also a free child.
Yeah.
I mean, he goes to work, but that's sort of it.
I mean, he naps a lot at work. I mean, his work is mostly donuts, napping, and then hijinks make up the rest of it. Very little is actually inspecting the safety of this nuclear power
So,
plant.
process of elimination, I guess Maggie needs to be one of the parents.
Maggie does keep people in line. She shot Mr. Burns that one time.
So she's the controlling parent as well. She's helping Marge. She's born into this world. She saw that there are 2 free children, 1 adapted child, and 1 parent doing both nurturing and controlling, and she went, I'll help that one. She's too small to do much nurturing. Maybe she nurtures Marge. She cuddles Marge back, I'm sure. But she helps with a little bit of the parenting by shooting Mr. Burns.
So true. And that's a lesson to you all. If you see your parents struggling, find a billionaire and shoot them.
Well, that's the message of this episode, I guess. So, as I said earlier, you've got this parent and this child, and in the middle of these 2 states is called the adult state. Now, the adult state is considered to have all the information from the parent and all the information from the child, and crucially, kind of all the information from the present moment, because it's not seeing the world through the lens, essentially, of the past, through the lens of conditioning, right? It has rationality, it is interested in evidence, and from a therapeutic perspective, if you're applying transactional analysis, the adult state is the one that you're trying to strengthen, right? So if you've got people who are stuck in a dynamic where they're often entering the child state, they're often entering the adult state, what you're trying to do is you're trying to go like, right, let's strengthen that adult state so they can stay in adult as much as possible.
This is sounding a lot like id, ego, and superego, right? That's the idea, right?
I mean, I haven't researched id, ego, superego, so I'm not totally sure.
Id would be the sort of child one that's more about impulses and just like, gimme, feelings, just, you know. The superego is, I think, more the sort of conscience aspect of it, which would be the sort of parent. And then the ego is the sort of self, you know, the one that is trying to mediate the other two.
Okay, so that's probably quite helpful. I think probably some of the stuff that Byrne added to this was, for example, he having not researched id, ego, superego, I can't say for sure, but he probably added stuff like the subcategories of parent. So, for example, you've got these two categories of parent or two broad categories of parent. You've got subcategories of child, but there was also a bunch of stuff that is in the games people play, which we'll get into to a certain extent in this episode. It's very complex, but we'll get into it a little bit later, which is about how these interactions can happen between people externally, and how people aren't necessarily aware of what they're doing all the time, and how they can be playing games with each other in order to fulfill certain needs they have, emotional needs. I will get into this later properly. And also, I wonder whether id, ego, superego is more internal. It's more like thinking about the id, ego, superego inside you and how that happens inside. Whereas transactional analysis has quite a lot of emphasis on looking at how you are part of the transactions you experience.